Her name was Lieutenant Kara Devlin, and in the rigid order of a military training hall, she was the one person you would never expect to see disrespected. Yet the silence was broken by something no one anticipated, a sharp crack of a palm across her face. A trainee, bigger, louder, desperate to show off in front of his peers, had crossed a line that most knew should never be crossed. The room froze. Time seemed to suspend itself in that echo. Every soldier present expected the fury of a Navy SEAL unleashed in that instant. But what came instead was far more unsettling. Kara didn't flinch, didn't even lift a hand in defense. Slowly, with deliberate calm, she reached up and straightened the crease of her uniform. Her gaze didn't seek retaliation, it didn't even acknowledge the offender. Without a word, without a glance, she simply turned and walked out of the room. No raised voice, no explosion, just footsteps fading against the tile, leaving the trainee standing there with his bravado suddenly hollow. The silence that followed was heavier than the strike itself. Whispers stayed locked in the throats of every witness. Because in that moment, no one understood what they had really seen. Was she afraid? Was she conceding? Or was something else happening? Something much larger, far more dangerous, just outside their comprehension? The absence of reaction unsettled them more than any retaliation could have. And that is where the story truly begins. Because what followed wasn't about anger, wasn't about revenge. It was about discipline so sharp it could cut through arrogance like a blade. What followed would teach every man in that room, and every officer on that base, why you never mistake silence for surrender, and why you never, under any circumstance, lay a hand on a Navy SEAL. By the next morning, the slap was no longer confined to the training hall. It had rippled across the base like a shockwave, whispered in mess lines, muttered in corridors, dissected in barracks after lights out. Some insisted Lieutenant Devlin had frozen, that she had folded beneath the weight of humiliation. Others shook their heads, lowering their voices as though speaking treason, and claimed she must have been too scared to respond. Every retelling added layers of drama, and the truth grew harder to separate from speculation. At the center of it all was Captain Reese Maddox. Tall, broad, quick with a grin, he carried himself like a man who had just proven a point. Over coffee in the officers' lounge, he boasted that Kara had cracked, that her silence was proof she didn't belong at the top tier of command. His laughter carried further than he realized, feeding the narrative that a Navy SEAL, of all people, had been humbled by a single act of defiance. To the uninitiated, his words sounded convincing. But the men and women who had served long enough to know Kara Devlin's name exchanged different glances. They said little, but behind their eyes was recognition. They understood that silence from her wasn't weakness. It was warning, because Kara Devlin had a history, not the kind etched into medals or paraded at ceremonies, but the kind that whispered through classified briefings and lived in the margins of after-action reports. There had been a mission in Afghanistan, years back, one that most of the base had never heard of. The details never appeared in press releases, and no journalist ever pieced together the fragments. What they did know, those who were cleared to know, was that she had walked into a village boiling with hostilities and walked out hours later with not a single shot fired, yet with an entire hostile cell dismantled and disarmed. No casualties, no collateral damage, just results that intelligence analysts still couldn't quite explain. That story never made it into Maddox's conversations. He didn't know it, or perhaps he never bothered to ask. But the senior officers did, and when they heard his bragging, they didn't laugh with him. They watched quietly, letting the rumors run their course, knowing that in due time, the very man so proud of landing a slap would learn what others already understood. Kara Devlin wasn't someone you provoked and walked away from unchanged. Kara never filed the report. No paperwork, no formal grievance, not even a word to the chain of command. That silence unsettled people more than the incident itself. In a place where regulations and red tape dictated every move, her decision to leave the system out of it whispered something different, something sharper. Instead of lodging a complaint, she quietly scheduled a reflex drill exercise. It wasn't on the official calendar. It wasn't routed through the usual channels. Yet the invite list went out all the same, and on it were only a handful of names. Captain Reese Maddox, two of his loudest supporters, and, by coincidence or design, a couple of neutral officers who had been in the room when the slap happened. The drill would run late at night, under red combat lighting, no live fire, just controlled mobility and reflex tests. On paper, it looked routine. To those who knew better, it didn't. In the stillness of her quarters, Kara prepared. She pulled an old case from the bottom of her locker, a case she hadn't touched in years. Inside was a patch, faded, frayed at the edges, the insignia of her SEAL team from another life. She didn't pin it to her uniform. That wasn't her way. Instead, she held it in her palm, the weight of it more symbolic than the cloth itself. It wasn't about nostalgia. It was about memory, about the promise of who she was trained to be. On her desk sat a weathered logbook, pages filled with neat handwriting and mission records that spanned continents. She turned to the back, flipped past lines of entries marked with times, coordinates, clearance codes. Then she wrote just 3 words. Correction required. She closed the book softly, almost like sealing a verdict. No anger in her face, no visible tension. Only calm, as though the decision was already complete and the execution would be inevitable. That composure didn't go unnoticed. A junior officer passing her in the corridor caught a glimpse, her uniform immaculate, her expression unreadable, but her steps carrying the quiet weight of inevitability. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes betrayed recognition. He had seen that kind of calm before, in stories told about operations that never reached the public. And he knew, without being told, that something significant was about to unfold. Maddox might have been celebrating his small victory, but anyone who understood Kara Devlin's silence knew it for what it really was. The sound of a storm gathering strength just beyond the horizon. The training floor was drenched in red light, shadows stretching across plywood walls and narrow corridors designed to disorient. The low hum of cameras came alive overhead, their lenses fixed on the maze below. In the tower above, senior officers watched from behind glass, silent, unreadable. The intercom crackled once, and Kara's voice, low and steady, filled the chamber. Scenario start. Then the speakers went dead. At first, Maddox and his men treated it like theater. Their laughter carried in the gloom, bouncing off walls that made the sound sharper than intended. She thinks she can spook us with mood lighting, one of them muttered. It's a game, Maddox said with a smirk, and we already know who wins. Boots thudded as they advanced into the first corridor, weapons raised in casual formation, their confidence loud enough to mask the unease that hung in the air. But then came silence. Not the natural kind, but silence designed, engineered to unsettle. And in that silence, movement. A blur in the corner, a shift too fast to process, and one of Maddox's men was yanked off balance. His weapon clattered against the floor before anyone could react. A gloved hand pressed against his jawline. A swift lock folded his body into the mat, and the red light blinked on his vest, neutralized. Kara vanished before the others even processed what had happened. No sound, no warning. The laughter evaporated. Maddox barked, "Stay tight. Don't give her angles." But his voice betrayed something new, an edge of uncertainty. They moved forward, but every step echoed too loud. Every breath seemed amplified, and the walls seemed to lean closer, funneling them towards something they couldn't see. Then Maddox saw her, a silhouette cutting through the haze of red light. He charged, arms wide, brute force against calm precision. For a heartbeat, it looked as though sheer power might overwhelm. But Kara didn't meet him head-on. She pivoted, redirected his momentum with the slightest shift, and his body folded over his own center of gravity. The impact of him hitting the mat thundered through the chamber. Before he could recover, she had locked his shoulder and pressed her weight just enough to pin him flat. His men froze, unable to step forward, unwilling to step back. From the tower, no one spoke. Every observer leaned forward, breath caught in their throats, watching the same truth unfold. Strength wasn't about noise or swagger. It was about control, quiet and undeniable. Kara leaned close enough for Maddox to hear her words, her voice as even as when she started the drill. "You mistook silence for surrender. That was your mistake." Then she released him, stood, and without even breaking her breathing rhythm, vanished back into the shadows, leaving him on the mat, winded, stunned, and finally aware of what everyone else had already known. The review board convened in a room that felt colder than the training maze. Polished wood, neutral carpet, and the kind of silence that pressed on every word spoken. At the head sat senior officers, files stacked neatly, observation footage queued on monitors. Maddox entered with his usual swagger dimmed, his uniform still crisp, but his eyes betraying a sleepless night. Kara sat opposite, her posture steady, hands folded on the table, no need to shift or fidget. She had already said more in her silence than he had with 100 boasts. When asked to explain himself, Maddox tried at first to mask his arrogance as confidence. He spoke of misunderstanding, of testing boundaries, of trying to push the limits of training. But as the footage rolled, first the slap, then the drill, the weight of evidence crushed every excuse. His words grew thinner, his voice less certain. The board didn't need to raise their tone. The facts alone dismantled him. Then it was Kara's turn. Her voice was calm, deliberate, without a trace of gloating. She explained the drill not as punishment, but as instruction conducted within regulation. Every clearance had been logged, every parameter aligned with protocol. She slid a neatly prepared document across the table. Timestamps, authorizations, waivers. It wasn't revenge she had carried out. It was correction, precise and professional. The senior officers exchanged glances, not of doubt, but of respect. One leaned forward, noting her restraint under direct provocation, her refusal to let ego dictate her actions. In a world where retaliation was easy, Kara had chosen discipline. And that choice, they said, set the standard for everyone who wore the uniform. The ruling was swift. Maddox, suspended, removed from field instruction, his reputation in shambles. Kara, commended, her actions formally recognized as exemplary. She offered no smile, no outward sign of triumph. But the room felt it, the unmistakable weight of justice delivered. The base carried a different tone in the days that followed. Conversations in the chow hall softened, jokes were told in lower voices, and when Kara entered a room, the posture of those inside straightened without command. She never asked for reverence, never demanded it, yet it followed her like a shadow, the kind that comes not from fear, but from recognition. People didn't just see her as an instructor anymore. They saw her as the living example of the standard they had sworn to uphold. One evening, as she walked the perimeter trail in her steady, measured stride, a young recruit caught up to her, nervous but determined. He hesitated before speaking, his words tumbling out almost against his will. "Commander, how did you stay calm? When it happened, how did you not react?" His voice carried the curiosity of someone who wasn't just asking about that day, but about the kind of strength he longed for himself. Kara slowed just enough to meet his gaze. Her expression didn't soften or harden. It simply held the weight of someone who had lived what she was about to say. "Discipline isn't silence," she answered evenly. "It's control. It's knowing when to act and when not to. Power isn't in the noise. It's in the choice." The recruit nodded, the words settling into him like a lesson he would carry longer than any drill. Kara resumed her stride, the quiet night folding around her. She left no speeches, no warnings, just the echo of footsteps and a truth that lingered. Silence had never been surrender. It had been strength all along. Would you have stayed calm if someone slapped you in uniform? Could you have stood there, steady, letting the silence speak louder than any outburst? Or do you think you might have reacted on impulse, only to realize later that retaliation rarely teaches the lesson discipline does? Moments like these force us to ask ourselves where true strength lies, and whether we're willing to embrace it when everyone is watching. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and tell me what you would have done. I read every single one. If this story reminded you that discipline can strike harder than anger ever could, hit the like button and make sure you're subscribed with the bell icon turned on so you don't miss the next mission. And speaking of next time, our upcoming story takes us inside another test of leadership under pressure, where silence, courage, and control become the difference between collapse and command. It's already waiting for you on screen. Go watch it now, and I'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place.